Hello, everyone. My name is Billy, and we're going to pick up where we left off with the sixth and final chapter of Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. When she got back to Echo Courts, she found Miles, Dean, Sergei, and Leonard arranged around and on the diving board at the end of a swimming pool with all their instruments, so composed and motionless that some photographer hidden from Oedipa might have been shooting them for an album illustration. "What's happening?" said Oedipa. "Your young men," replied Miles. Metzger really put it to Sergei, our countertenor. "The lad is crackers with grief." "She's right, missus," said Sergei. "I even wrote a song about it, whose arrangements feature none other than me, and it goes like this. What chance has a lonely surfer boy for the love of a surfer chick, with all these Humbert cats coming so big and sick? For me, my baby was a woman. For him, she's just another nymphette. Why did they run around? Why did she put me down? And why and get me so upset? Well, as long as she's gone away, yay, I've had to find somebody new, and the older generation has taught me what to do. I had a date last night with an 8-year-old, and she's a swinger just like me. So you can find us any night up on the football field in back of PS 33. Oh yeah, and it's as groovy as it can be." "You're trying to tell me something," said Oedipa. They gave it to her then in prose. Metzger and Sergei's chick had run off to Nevada to get married. Sergei, on a close questioning, admitted the bit that of the 8-year-old was so far only imaginary, but that he was hanging diligently around playgrounds, and should have some news for them any day. On top of the TV set in her room, Metzger had left a note telling her not to worry about the estate, that he'd turned over his executorship to somebody at Warp, Wistful, Kubitschek, and McMingus, and they should be in touch with her. And it was all squared with the probate court also. No word to recall Oedipa and Metzger had ever been more than co-executors. Which must mean, thought Oedipa, that that's all they were. She should have felt more classically scorned, but had other things on her mind. First thing after unpacking, she was on the horn to Randolph Driblet, the director. After about 10 rings, an elderly lady answered, "I'm sorry, we have nothing to say." "Well, who's this?" Oedipa said. Sigh. This is his mother. There will be a statement at noon tomorrow. Our lawyer will read it." She hung up. Now, what the hell, Oedipa wondered. What had happened to Driblet? She decided to call later. She found Professor Emery Bortz's number in the book and had better luck. A wife named Grace answered, backed up by a group of children. He's pouring a patio," she told Oedipa. "It's a highly organized joke that's been running since about April. He sits in the sun, drinks beer with students, lobs beer bottles at seagulls. You'd better talk to him before it gets that far. Maxine, why don't you throw that at your brother? He's more mobile than I am. Did you know Emery's done a new edition of Wharfinger? It'll be out." But the date was obliterated by a great crash, maniacal childish laughter, high-pitched squeals. "Oh, God, have you ever met an infanticide? Come on over, it might be your only chance." Oedipa showered, put on a sweater, skirt, and sneakers, wrapped her hair in a student-like twist, went easy on the makeup, recognizing with a vague sense of dread that this was not a matter of Bortz's response, or Grace's, but of the Tristeros. Driving over, she passed by Zapp's used books, and was alarmed to find a pile of charred rubble where the bookstore only a week ago had stood. There was still the smell of burnt leather. She stopped and went to the government surplus outlet next door. The owner informed her that Zapp, the damn fool, had sent fire to his own store for the insurance. "Any kind of a wind," snarled his worthy, "and it would have taken me with it. They only put up this complex here to last 5 years anyway. But could Zapp wait? Books." You had the feeling that it was only his good upbringing kept him from spitting. "You want to sell something used?" he advised Oedipa. "Find out what there's a demand for. This season, now it's your rifles. Fellow was just in this afternoon, bought 200 for his drill team. I could have sold him 200 of the swastika armbands, too, only I was short, damn it." "Government surplus swastikas?" Oedipa asked. "Oh, hell no." He gave her an insider's wink. "Got this little factory down outside of San Diego," he told her. "Got a dozen of your niggers, say, and you can turn them old armbands out. You'd be surprised how the little number's selling. I took some space in the couple of the girly magazines. I had to hire 2 extra niggers last week to take care of the mail." "What's your name?" Oedipa said. "Winthrop Tremaine," replied the spirited entrepreneur. "Winter for short. Listen, Now we're getting up an arrangement with one of these big ready-to-wear outfits in L.A. To see how SS uniforms go for the fall. We're working it out in the back-to-school campaign. A lot of 37 songs, teenage kid sizes. Next season, we may be all the way out and get out a modified version for the ladies. How would that strike you? I'll let you know, Oedipa said. I'll keep you in mind. She left, wondering if she should have called him something or tried to hit him with any of a dozen surplus heavy blunt objects in easy reach. There had been no witnesses. Why hadn't she? You're chicken, she told herself, snapping her seatbelt. This is America. You live in it. You let it happen. Let it unfurl. She drove savagely along the freeway, hunting for Volkswagens. By the time she'd pulled into Bortz's subdivision, a riparian settlement in the style of Fangoso Lagoons, she was only shaking and a little nauseous in the stomach. She was greeted by a small fat girl with some blue substance smeared all over her face. "Hi," said Oedipa. "You must be Maxine." "Maxine's in bed. She threw one of Daddy's beer bottles at Charles, and it went through the window, and Mama spanked her good. If she was mine, I'd drown her." "Never thought of doing it that way," said Grace Bortz, materializing from the dim living room. "Come on in." With her wet washcloth, she started to clean off her child's face. "How did you manage to get away from yours today?" "I don't have any," said Oedipa, following her into the kitchen. Grace looked surprised. "There's a certain harassed style," she said, "you get to recognize. I thought only kids caused it. I guess not." Emery Bortz lay half in a hammock, surrounded by 3 graduate students, 2 male, 1 female, all sodden with drink, and an astounding accumulation of empty beer bottles. Oedipa located a full one and seated herself out in the grass. "I would like to find out," she presently plunged, "something about the historical Wharfinger, not so much the verbal one." "The historical Shakespeare?" growled one of the grad students through a full beard, uncapping another bottle. "The historical Marx? The historical Jesus?" "He's right," shrugged Bortz. "They're dead. What's left?" "Words." "Pick some words," said Bortz. "Them we can talk about." "No hallowed skein of stars can ward, I trow," quoted Oedipa, "who's once set this tryst with Tristero." Courier's Tragedy, Act 4, Scene 8. Bortz blinked at her. "And how," he said, "did you get into the Vatican Library?" Oedipa showed him the paperback with the lion on it. Bortz, squinting at the page, groped for another beer. "My God," he announced, "I've been pirated. Me and Wharfinger, we've been Baudelarized in reverse or something." He flipped to the front to see who'd re-edited this edition of Wharfinger. "Ashamed to sign it. Damn. I'll have to write the publishers. K. Dutch and Gatto. And company? You ever heard of them? New York." He looked at the sun through a page or two. Offset. Brought his nose close to the text. Misprints. Gah, corrupt. He dropped the book on the grass and looked at it with loathing. How did they get into the Vatican, then? "What's in the Vatican?" asked Oedipa. "A pornographic Courier's Tragedy. I didn't get to see it till 61, or I would have given it a note in my old edition." What I saw out in the Tank Theater wasn't pornographic? Randy Dreblett's production? No. I thought it was typically virtuous." He looked sadly past her through a stretch of sky. He was a particularly moral man. He felt hardly any responsibility toward the word, really, but to the invisible field surrounding the play, its spirit. He was always intensely faithful. If anyone could have called up that historical Wharfinger you want, it'd have been Randy. Nobody else I ever knew was so close to the author, to the microcosm of that play, as it must have surrounded Wharfinger's living mind. "But you're using the past tense," Oedipa said, her heart pounding, remembering the old lady on the phone. "Hadn't you heard?" They all looked at her. Death glided by, shadowless, among the empties in the grass. "Randy walked into the Pacific 2 nights ago," the girl said. Told her finally. Her eyes had been red all along. "In his Ganaro suit, he's dead, and this is awake." "I tried to call him this morning," was all Oedipa could think of to say. "It was right after they struck the set of the Courier's Tragedy," Bortz said. Even a month ago, Oedipa's next question would have been, why? But now she kept a silence, waiting, as if to be illuminated. "They're stripping from me," he said subvocally, feeling like a fluttering curtain in a very high window, moving up to then cover the abyss. "They're stripping away, one by one, my men. My shrink, pursued by Israelis, has gone mad. My husband, on LSD, gropes like a child further and further into the rooms and endless rooms of the elaborate candy house of himself and away, hopelessly away from what is past. I was hoping forever, for love. My one extramarital fellow has eloped with a depraved 15-year-old. My best guide back to the Tristero has taken a Brody. Where am I? I'm sorry, Bortz had also said, watching her. Oedipus stayed with it. Did he use only that? Pointed to the paperback. For his script? No. Frowning. He used the hardcover edition, my edition. But the night you saw the play, too much sunlight shone on the bottles, silent all around them. How did he end the fourth act? What were his lines, driblets, generos, when they're all standing around the lake after the miracle? He that we last, as Thurn and Taxus knew, recited Bortz, now recks no lord but the stiletto's thorn, and tacit lies the gold once knotted horn. Right, agreed the grad students, yeah. That's all? What about the rest, the other couplet? In the text I go along with personally, said Bortz, that other couplet has the last line suppressed. The book in the Vatican is only an obscene parody. The ending, who once has crossed the lusts of Angelo, was put by a printer in the 1687 quarto. The Whitechapel version is corrupt. So Randy did the best thing, left the doubtful part out altogether. But the night I was there, Oedipus said, Driblet did use the Vatican lines. He said the word Tristero. Bortz's face stayed neutral. It was up to him. He was both director and actor, right? But would it be just, she gestured in circles in her hand, just some whim? To use another couple lines like that without telling anybody? Randy recalled the third grad student, a stocky kid with horn rims. What was bugging him inside usually, somehow or other, would have to come outside on stage. He might have looked at a lot of versions to develop the feel for the spirit of the play, not necessarily the words, and that's how he came across your paperback there, with a variation in it. Then, Oedipa concluded, something must have happened in his personal life, something that must have changed him drastically that night, and that's what made him put the lines in. Maybe, said Bortz, maybe not. You think a man's mind is a pool table? I hope not. Come in and see some dirty pictures, Bortz invited, rolling off the hammock. They left the students drinking beer. Illicit microfilms of the illustrations there in the Vatican edition, smuggled out in 61. Grace and I were there on a grant. They entered a combination workroom and study. Far away in the house, children screamed, a vacuum whined. Bortz drew shades, riffled through a box of slides, selected a handful, switched on a projector, and aimed it at a wall. The illustrations were woodcuts, executed with that crude haste to see the finished product that marks the amateur. True pornography is given by vastly patient professionals. The artist is anonymous, Bortz said. So is the poetaster who wrote the play. Here, Pasquale, remember, one of the bad guys, actually does marry his mother, and there's a whole scene on their wedding night. He changed slides. You get in the general idea. Notice how often the figure of death hovers in the background, the moral rage. It's a throwback, it's medieval. No Puritan ever got that violent, except possibly the Scurvvmites. D'Amico thinks this edition was a Scurvvmite project. Scurvvmite? Robert Scurvvm had founded, during the reign of Charles I, a sect of most pure Puritans. Their central hang-up had to do with predestination. There were two kinds. Nothing for a Scurvvmite ever happened by accident. Creation was a vast, intricate machine, but one part of it, the Scurvvmite part, ran off with the will of God, its prime mover. The rest ran off in some opposite principle, something blind, soulless, a brute automatism that led to eternal death. The idea was to woo converts into the godly and purposeful sodality of the Scurvvmite, but somehow those few saved Scurvvmites found themselves looking into a gaudy clockwork of the doomed with a certain sick and fascinated horror, and this was to prove fatal. One by one, the most glamorous prospect of annihilation coaxed them over, until there was no one left in the sect, not even Robert Scurvvm, who, like a ship's master, had been the last to go. What did Richard Warfinger have to do with them? Asked Oedipa. Why would they do a dirty version of this play? As a moral example. They were not fond of the theater. It was their way of putting the play entirely away from them, into hell. What better way to damn it eternally than to change the actual words? Remember that Puritans were utterly devoted, like literary critics, to the word. But the line about Tristero isn't dirty. He scratched his head. It fits, surely. The hallowed skein of stars is God's will, but even that can't ward or guard somebody who's on an appointment with Tristero. I mean, say you only talked about crossing the lusts of Angelo. Hell, there'd be any number of ways to get out of that. Leave the country. Angelo's only a man, but the brute other, that which kept the non-Scurvvmite universe running like clockwork, that was something else again. Evidently, they felt Tristero would symbolize the other quite well. She had nothing more than to put it off with. Again, with the light, vertiginous sense of fluttering out over an abyss, she asked what she'd been there to ask. What was Tristero? One of several brand new areas, said Bortz, that opened up after I did that edition in 57. We've since come across some interesting old source material. My updated edition ought to be out, they tell me, next year sometime. Meanwhile, he went on looking in a glass case full of ancient books. Here, producing one with a dark brown, peeling calf cover. I keep my Wharfingeriana locked in here so the kids can't get at it. Charles could ask no end of questions I'm too young to cope with yet. The book was titled An Account of the Singular Peregrinations of Dr. Diocletian Blob Among the Italians, illuminated with exemplary tales from the true history of that outlandish and fantastical race. Lucky for me, said Bortz, Wharfinger, like Milton, kept a commonplace book, where he jotted down notes and things from his reading. That's how we know about Blob's peregrinations. It was full of words ending in E's, S's that looked like F's, capitalized nouns, Y's where I's should have been. I can't read this, Oedipus said. Try, said Bortz. I have to see these kids off. I think it's around chapter 7, and disappeared to leave Oedipa before the tabernacle. And as it turned out, it was a chapter 8 she wanted. A report of the author's own encounter with the Tristero brigands. Diocletian Blob had chosen to traverse a stretch of desolate mountain territory in a mail coach belonging to the Tor and Tassus system, which Oedipa figured must be Italian for Thurn and Taxus. Without warning, by the shores of what Blob called the Lake of Piety, they were set upon by a score of black-cloaked riders, who engaged them in a fierce, silent struggle in the icy wind blowing in from the lake. The marauders used cudgels, harquebuses, swords, stilettos, at the end silk kerchiefs to dispatch those still breathing. All except for Dr. Blob and his servant, who had dissociated themselves from the hassle at the very outset, proclaiming in loud voices that they were British subjects, and even from time to time ventured to sing certain of the more improving of our church's hymns. Their escape surprised Oedipa, in view of what seemed to be Tristero's passion for security. Was Tristero trying to set up shop in England? Bortz suggested, days later. Oedipa didn't know, but why spare an insufferable ass like Diocletian Blob? Well, you could spot a mouth like that a mile off, Bortz said. Even in the cold, even with your bloodlust up. If I wanted word to get up to England, to sort of pave the way, I should think he'd be perfect. Tristero enjoyed counter-revolution in those days. Look at England. The king was about to lose his head. A setup. The leader of the brigands, after collecting the mail sacks, had pulled Blob from the coach and addressed him in perfect English. Messer, you have witnessed the wrath of Tristero. Know that we are not without mercy. Tell your king and parliament what we have done. Tell them that we will prevail, that neither tempest nor strife, nor fierce beasts, nor the loneliness of the desert, nor yet the illegitimate usurpers of our rightful estate can deter our couriers. And leaving them and their purses intact, the highwaymen, in a cracking of cloaks like black sails, vanished back to their twilight mountains. Blob inquired about the Tristero organization, running into zipped mouths nearly every way he turned, but he was able to collect a few fragments. So, in the days following, was Oedipa. From obscure phylactic journals, furnished her by the Genghis Khan, an ambiguous footnote in Motley's Rise of the Dutch Republic, an 80-year-old pamphlet in the roots of modern anarchism. A book of sermons by Blob's brother Augustine, also among Bortz's Wharfingeriano, along with Blob's original clues. Oedipa was able to fit together this account of how the organization began. In 1577, The northern provinces of the Low Countries, led by that Protestant noble William of Orange, had been struggling 9 years for independence from Catholic Spain and a Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. In late December, Orange, de facto master of the Low Countries, entered Brussels in triumph, having been invited there by a committee of 18. This was a junta of Calvinist fanatics who felt that the Estates General, controlled by the privileged classes, no longer represented the skilled workers, had lost touch entirely with the people. The committee set up a kind of Brussels commune. They controlled the police, dictated all decisions of the Estates General, and threw out many holders of high position in Brussels. Among these was Leonard I, Baron of Taxis, gentleman of the Emperor's privy chamber, and Baron of Bissingen, the hereditary Grand Master of the Post for the Low Countries, and executor of the Thurn and Taxis monopoly. He was replaced by one Jan Hinkert, Lord of Ohain, a loyal adherent of Orange. At this point, the founding figure enters the scene, Hernando Joaquin de Tristero y Calavera, perhaps a madman, perhaps an honest rebel, according to some, only a con artist. Tristero claimed to be Jan Hinkart's cousin from the Spanish and legitimate branch of the family, and true lord of Ohain, rightful heir to everything Jan Hinkert then possessed, including his recent appointment as Grand Master. From 1578 until Alexander Farnese took Brussels back again for the Emperor in March 1585, Tristero kept up what amounted to a guerrilla war against his cousin, if Hinkert was his cousin. Being Spanish, he got little support. Most of the time, from one quarter or another, his life was in danger. Still, he tried 4 times to assassinate Orange's postmaster, though without success. Jan Hinkert was dispossessed by Farnese, and Leonard I, the Thurn and Taxis Grand Master, reinstated. But it had been a time of great instability for the Thurn and Taxis monopoly. Leery of strong Protestant leanings in that Bohemian branch of the family, the Emperor Rudolph II had for a time withdrawn his patronage. The postal operation plunged deeply into the red. It may have been some vision of the continent-wide power structure Hinkert could have taken over, how momentarily weakened and tottering that inspired Tristero to set up his own system. He seems to have been highly unstable, apt at any time to appear at a public function and begin a speech. His constant theme, disinheritance. The postal monopoly belonged to Ohain by right of conquest, and Ohain belonged to Tristero by right of blood. He styled himself El Desheredado, the disinherited, and fashioned a livery of black for his followers, black to symbolize the only thing that truly belonged to them in their exile, the night. Soon, he had added to his iconography the muted post horn and a dead badger with its 4 feet in the air. Some said that the name of Taxis came from the Italian tasso, badger, referring to hats of badger fur the early Bermagusian couriers wore. He began a Sub Rosa campaign of obstruction, terror, and depredation along the Thurn and Taxis mail routes. Oedipa spent her next several days Oedipa spent the next several days in and out of libraries, and earnest discussions with Emery Bortz and Genghis Khan. She feared a little for their security in view of what was happening to everyone else she knew. The day after reading Blob's Peregrinations, she, with Bortz, Grace, and the graduate students, attended Randolph Drublet's funeral. Listened to a younger brother's helpless, stricken eulogy, watching the mother, spectral in afternoon smog, cry, and came back at night to sit on the grave and drink Napa Valley Muscatel, which Drublet, in his time, had put away barrels of. There was no moon, smog covered the stars, all black as a Tristero rider. Oedipa sat on the earth, ass getting cold, wondering whether, as Drublet had suggested that night from the shower, some version of herself hadn't vanished with him. Perhaps her mind would go on flexing psychic muscles that no longer existed, would be betrayed and mocked by a phantom self, as the amputee is by a phantom limb. Some day she might replace whatever of her has gone away by some prosthetic device. A dress of a certain color, a phrase in a letter, another lover. She tried to reach out to whatever coded tenacity of protein might improperly have held on 6 feet below, still resisting decay, any stubborn quiescence, perhaps gathering itself for that last burst, some last scramble up through the earth, just glimmering, holding together with its final strength a transient winged shape, needing to settle at once in the warm host, or dissipate forever into the dark. "If you come to me," prayed Oedipa, "bring your memories of the last night, or, if you have to keep down your payload, the last 5 minutes. That may be enough. But so I'll know if your walking to the sea had anything to do with Tristero, if they got rid of you, for the reason they got rid of Hilarious and Mucho and Metzger, maybe because they thought I no longer needed you. They were wrong. I needed you. Only bring me that memory, and you can live with me for whatever time I've got." She remembered his head floating in the shower, saying, "You could fall in love with me, but could she have saved him?" She looked over at the girl who'd given her the news of his death. Had they been in love? Did she know why Driblet had put in those 2 extra lines that night? Had he even known why? No one could begin to trace it. 100 hang-ups, permuted, combined sex, money, illness, despair with the history of his time and place. Who knew? Changing the script had no clearer motive than his suicide. There was the same whimsy to both. Perhaps, she felt briefly penetrated, as if the bright-winged thing had actually made it to the sanctuary of her heart. Perhaps, springing from that same slick labyrinth, adding those 2 lines had even, in a way never to be explained, served him as a rehearsal for tonight's walk away into that vast sink of the primal blood of the Pacific. She waited for the winged brightness to announce its safe arrival, but there was a silence. "Driblet," she called. A signal echoing down twisted miles of brain circuitry. "Driblet!" But, as with the Maxwell's demon, so now. Either she could not communicate, or he did not exist. Beyond its origins, the libraries told her nothing more about Tristero. For all they knew, it had never survived the struggle for Dutch independence. To find the rest, she had to approach from the Thurn-and-Taxis side. This had its perils. For Emery Bortz, it seemed to turn into a species of cute game. He held, for instance, to a mirror image theory, by which any period of instability for Thurn-and-Taxis must have its reflection in Tristero's shadow state. She applied to this the mystery of why the dread name should have appeared in print only around the middle of the 17th century. How had the author of the pun in this Tristero Desire overcome his reluctance? How had half of the Vatican couplet, with its suppression of the Tristero line, found its way into the folio? Whence had the daring of even hinting at Thurn-and-Taxis' rival come? Bortz maintained that there must have been some crisis inside Tristero grave enough to keep them from retaliating. Perhaps the same that kept them from taking the life of Dr. Blob. But should Bortz have exfoliated the mere word so lushly into such unnatural roses, under which, in whose red-scented dusk, dark history slithered unseen, when Leonard II Francis, Count of Thurn-and-Taxis, died in 1648, his wife, Alexandrine of Rye, succeeded him in name as postmaster, though her tenure was never considered official. She retired in 1645. The actual locus of power in the monopoly maintained uncertain until 1650, when the next male heir, Lamoureux II, Claude Francis, took over. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Antwerp, signs of decay in the system had appeared. Private local posts had encroached so far on the imperial licenses that 2 cities shut down their Thurn-and-Taxis offices. How, Bortz asked, would Tristero have responded? Postulating then some militant fashion, proclaiming the great moment finally at hand, advocating a takeover by force while their enemy was vulnerable, but conservative opinion would care only to continue in opposition, exactly as the Tristero had these 70 years. There might also be, say, a few visionaries, men above the immediacy of their time who could think historically. At least one of them among them was hip enough to foresee the end of the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, the breakup of the empire, the coming descent into particularism. "He looks like Kirk Douglas," cried Bortz. "He's wearing his sword. His name is something gutsy, like Conrad. They're meeting in the back room of the tavern, all these broads in peasant blouses, carrying steins around. Everybody juiced and yelling. Suddenly, Conrad jumps up on the table. The crowd hushes. The salvation of Conrad. The salvation of Europe, Conrad says, depends on communication, right? We face this anarchy of jealous German princes, hundreds of them scheming, counter-scheming, infighting, dissipating all of the empire's strength in their useless bickering. But whoever had control the lines of communication among all these princes would control them. That network someday could unify the continent. So I propose that we merge with our old enemy, Thurn-and-Taxis." Cries of "No, never! Throw the traitor out!" till this barmaid, little starlet, sweet on Conrad, cold conks with a stein, his loudest antagonist. Together, Conrad is saying, our two systems would be invincible. We could refuse service on any but an imperial basis. Nobody could move troops, farm produce, anything without us. Any prince tries to start his own courier system, we suppress it. We, who have so long been disinherited, could be the heirs of Europe. Prolonged cheering. But they didn't keep the empire from falling apart, Oedipa pointed out. So, Bortz backing off. The militants and the conservatives fight to a standstill. Conrad and his little group of visionaries, being nice guys, try to mediate the hassle. By the time they all get squared away again, everybody's played out. The empire's had it, Thurn and Taxis wants no deals. And, with the end of the Holy Roman Empire, the fountainhead of Thurn and Taxis' legitimacy is lost forever among other splendid delusions. Possibilities for paranoia became abundant. If Tristero has managed to maintain even partial secrecy, if Thurn and Taxis have no clear idea who their adversary is or how far its influence extends, then many of them must come to believe in something that's very much like the Scurvvmites' blind, automatic anti-god. Whatever it is, it has the power to murder their writers, send landslides thundering across their roads, by extension bring into being new local competition, and presently even state postal monopolies disintegrate their empire. It is their time's ghost, out to put the Thurn and Taxis ass in a sling. But, over the next century and a half, the paranoia recedes, as they come to discover the secular Tristero, power, omniscience, implacable malice, attributes of which they thought to be a historical principle, a zeitgeist, are carried over into a now human enemy. So much that, by 1795, it is even suggested that Tristero has staged the entire French Revolution, just for excuse to issue the proclamation of 9th Premier, and 11, and 3, ratifying the end of the Thurn and Taxis postal monopoly in France and the lowlands. Suggested by who, though? Said Oedipa. Did you read that somewhere? Wouldn't somebody have brought it up? Bortz said. Maybe not. He didn't press the argument, having begun to feel reluctant about following up anything. She hadn't asked Genghis Khan, for example, if his expert committee had ever reported back to the stamps he'd sent them. She knew that if she went back to Vesperhaven House to talk again to old Mr. Thoth about his grandfather, she would find that he too had died. She knew that she ought to write to K. da Chingado, publisher of the unaccountable paperback Courier's Tragedy, but she didn't, and never asked Bortz if he had either. Worst of all, she found herself going often to absurd lengths to avoid talking about Randolph Drublet. Whenever the girl showed up, the one who'd been at the wakes, Oedipa found excuses to leave the gathering. She felt she was betraying Drublet and herself, but left it alone, anxious that her revelation not expand beyond a certain point, lest possibly it grow longer than she assumed to her, and she assumed her to herself. When Bortz asked her one evening if she could bring in D'Amico, who was at NYU, Oedipa told him no, too fast, too nervous. He didn't mention it again, and neither, of course, did she. So, she did go back to the scope, though. One night, restless, alone, leery of what she might find, she found Mike Fallopian. A couple weeks into raising a beard, wearing button-down olive shirt, creased fatigue pants minus cuffs and belt loops, 2-button fatigue jacket, no hat. He was surrounded by broads, drinking champagne cocktails and bellowing low songs. When he spotted Oedipa, he gave her a wide grin and waved her over. "You look," she said, "wow, like you're all the more training rebels up in the mountains." Hostile looks from the girls twined around what parts of Fallopian were accessible. "It's a revolutionary secret," he laughed, throwing up his arms and flinging off a couple of camp followers. "Go on now, all of you, I want to talk to this one." And when they were out of earshot, he swiveled to give her a sympathetic look, annoyed. Perhaps also a little erotic. "How's your quest?" She gave him a quick status report. She kept quiet while she talked, his expression slowly changing to something she couldn't recognize. It bothered her. To jog him a little, she said, "I'm surprised you people aren't using the system too." "Are we an underground?" He came back, mild enough. "Are we rejects?" I didn't mean, maybe we haven't found them yet," said Fallopian. "Or maybe they haven't approached us. Or maybe we are using waste, only it's a secret." Then, as electronic music began to percolate into the room, "But there's another angle, too." She sensed that he was going to say and began, reflexively to grind together her back molars, a nervous habit she'd developed in the last few days. Has it ever occurred to you, Oedipa, that somebody's putting you on, that this is all a hoax, maybe something in Verarity set up before he died? It had occurred to her, but like she thought that someday she would have to die, Oedipa had been steadfastly refusing to look at that possibility directly, or in any but the most accidental of lights. No, she said, that's ridiculous. Fallopian watched her, nothing if not compassionate. You ought, quietly. Really, you ought to think about it. Write down what you can't deny, your hard intelligence. Then write down what you've only speculated, assumed. See what you've got. At least that. Go ahead, she said, cold. At least that. What else, after that? He smiled. Perhaps now, trying to salvage whatever was going soundlessly smash, its net of invisible cracks propagating leisurely through the air between them. Please don't be mad. Verify my sources, I suppose, Oedipa kept on pleasantly. Right? He didn't say any more. She stood up, wondering if her hair was in place, if she looked rejected or hysterical, if they'd been causing a scene. I knew you'd be different, she said. Like, because everybody's been changing on me. But it hasn't gone as far as hating me. Hating you? He shook his head and laughed. If you need any armbands or more weapons, do try Winthrop Tremaine over on the freeway. Tremaine's swastika shop. Mention my name. We're already in touch, thanks. She left him in his modified Cuban ensemble, watching the floor, waiting for his broads to come back. Well, what about her sources? She was avoiding the question, yes. One day, Genghis Cohen called, sounding excited, and asked her to come see something he'd just got in the mail, the U.S. mail. It turned out to be an old American stamp, bearing the device of the muted post horn, belly-up badger, and the motto, We await silent Tristero's empire. So that's what it stands for, said Oedipa. Where did you get this? A friend, Cohen said, leafing through a battered Scott catalog in San Francisco. As usual, she did not go on to ask for any name or address. Odd. He said he couldn't find the stamp listed, but here it is, an addendum. Look. In the front of the book, a slip of paper had been pasted in. The stamp, designated 163L1, was reproduced under the title Tristero Rapid Post, San Francisco, California, and should have been inserted between local listings 139, the 3rd Avenue Post Office of New York, and 140, Union Post, also of New York. Oedipa, off at a kind of intuitive high, went immediately to the end paper in the back and found the sticker of Zapp's used books. Sure, Cohen protested. I drove out there one day to see Mr. Metzger. While you were up north, this is the Scott Specialized, you see, for American stamps. A catalog I don't generally keep up on. My field being European and colonial, but my curiosity had been aroused, so... Sure, Oedipa said. Anybody could paste in an addendum. She drove back to San Narciso to have another look at the list of Inverarity's assets. Sure enough, the whole shopping center had housed Zapp's used books, and Tremaine's surplus place had been owned by Pierce. Not only that, but the Tank Theater also. Okay, Oedipa told herself, stalking around the room. Her viscera hollow, waiting on something truly terrible. Okay, it's unavoidable, isn't it? Every access route to the Tristero could be traced back to the Inverarity estate. Even Emery Bortz, with his copy of Blob's Peregrinations, bought, she had no doubt, he'd tell her in the event she asked, also at Zapp's. Taught now at San Narciso College, heavily endowed by the dead man. Meaning what? That Bortz, along with Metzger, Cohen, Driblette, Kotex, the tattooed sailor in San Francisco, the waste carriers she'd seen, that all of them were Pierce and Verarity's men? Bought? Or loyal, for free, for fun, to some grandiose practical joke he'd cooked up, all for her embarrassment, or terrorizing, or moral improvement. Change your name to Miles, Dean, Sergei, and or Leonard, baby, she advised her reflection in the half-light of that afternoon's vanity mirror. Either way, they'd call it paranoia. They. Either you have stumbled about, indeed, without the aid of LSD or other indole alkaloids, into a secret richness and concealed density of dream, onto a network by which X number of Americans are truly communicating, whilst reserving their lies, recitations of routine, arid betrayals of spiritual poverty for the official government delivery system, even onto a real alternative to the exitlessness, to the existence of surprise to life, that harrows the head of anybody American you know, and you too, sweetie, or you are hallucinating it, or a plot has been mounted against you so expensive and elaborate involving items like the forging of stamps and ancient books, constant surveillance of your movements, planting of post-horn images all around San Francisco, bribing of librarians, hiring of professional actors, and Pearson Verity only knows what all. Besides, all financed out of the estate in either a way too secret or too involved for your non-legal mind to know about, even though you are co-executor, or labyrinthine, that it must have meaning beyond just a practical joke, or you are fantasying about some such plot, in which case you are a nut, Oedipa, out of your skull. Those, now that she was looking at them, she saw at the alternatives, those symmetrical four. She didn't like any of them, but hoped she was mentally ill. That's all it was. That night she sat for hours, too numb to even drink, teaching herself to breathe in a vacuum. For this, oh God, was the void. There was nobody who could help her, nobody in the world. They were all on something, mad, possible enemies, dead. Old fillings in her teeth began to bother her. She would spend nights staring at the ceiling, lit by the pink glow of San Narcisso's sky. Other nights she could sleep for 18 drugged hours and wake enervated, hardly able to stand. In conferences with a keen, fast-talking old man who was now counsel for the estate, her attention span could be measured in seconds, and she laughed nervously more than she spoke. Waves of nausea lasting 5 to 10 minutes would strike her at random, cause her deep misery, then vanish as if they had never been. There were headaches, nightmares, menstrual pains. One day she drove into L.A., picked a doctor at random from the phone book, went to her. He told her she thought she was pregnant. They arranged for tests. Oedipa gave her the name as Grace Bortz and didn't show up for her next appointment. Genghis Cohen, once so shy, now seemed to come up with new goodies about her every other day. A listing in an outdated Zumstein catalog, a friend in the Royal Philatelic Society's dim memory of some muted post-horn spied in the catalog of an auction held at Dresden in 1923, one day a typescript sent him by another friend in New York. It was supposed to be a translation of the article from an 1865 issue of the famous Bibliotheca des Trimbophiles of Jean-Baptiste Moens. Looks like another of Bortz's costume dramas. It told of a great schism in the Tristero ranks during the French Revolution. According to the recently discovered and decrypted journals of Comte Raoul Antoine de Vaucey, Marquis de Tours et Tassis, one element among the Tristero had never accepted the passing of the Holy Roman Empire, and saw the revolution as a temporary madness, feeling obliged as fellow aristocrats to help Thurn and Taxis weather its troubles. They put out probes to see if the house was interested at all in being subsidized. This move split the Tristero wide open. At the convention held in Milan, arguments raged for a week. Lifelong enmities were created. Families divided. Blood spilt. At the end of it, a resolution to subsidize Thurn and Taxis failed. Many conservatives, taking this as a millennial judgment against them, ended their association with the Tristero. Thus, the article smugly concluded, did the organization enter the penumbra of historical eclipse? From the Battle of Austerlitz until the difficulties of 1848, the Tristero drifted on, deprived of nearly all the noble patronage that had sustained them. Now, reduced to handling anarchist correspondence with only peripherally engaged. In Germany, with the ill-fated Frankfurt Assembly. In Budapest, with the barricades. Maybe even among the watchmakers of the Jura, preparing them for the coming of M. Buchanan. By far their greatest number, however, fled to America during 1849 to 1850, when they are no doubt at present rendering their services to those who seek to extinguish the flame of revolution. Less excited than she might have been even a week ago, Oedipa showed the piece to Emery Bortz. All the Tristero refugees from 1849 reaction arrive in America. It seemed to him full of high hopes. Only what do they find? Not really asking, it was part of his game. Trouble. Around 1845, the U.S. government had carried out a great postal reform, cutting their rates, putting most independent mail routes out of business. By the 70s and 80s, any independent carrier that tried to compete with the government was immediately squashed. In 1849 to 1850 was no time for any emigrating Tristero to get ideas about picking up where they'd left off back in Europe. So they simply stay on, Bortz said, in the context of conspiracy. Other immigrants come to America looking for freedom from tyranny, acceptance by the culture, assimilation into it. This melting pot. Civil War comes along, most of them being liberals, sign up to fight to preserve the Union, but clearly not the Tristero. All they've done is to change oppositions. By 1861, they're well established, not about to be suppressed. While the Pony Express is defying deserts, savages as sidewinders, Tristero is giving its employees crash courses in Siouan and Athapascan dialects. Disguised as Indians, their messengers mosey westward, reach the coast every time. Zero attrition rate, not a scratch on them. Their entire emphasis now toward silence, impersonation, opposition masquerading as allegiance. What about the stamp of Cohen's? We await silent Tristero's empire. They were more open in their youth. Latter, as the feds cracked down, they went over to their stamps that were almost kosher-looking, but not quite. Oedipa knew them by heart. In the 15-cent dark green from the 1893 Columbian Exposition issue, Columbus announcing his discovery, the faces of three courtiers, receiving the news at the right-hand side of the stamp, had been subtly altered to express uncontrollable fright. In the 3-cent Mothers of America issue, put out on Mother's Day in 1934, the flowers to the lower left of the Whistler's mother had been replaced by Venus's flytrap. Belladonna, poison sumac, and a few others Oedipa had never seen. In the 1947 postage stamp centenary issue, commemorating the great postal reform that had meant the beginning of the end for private carriers, the end of a Pony Express rider at the lower left was set at a disturbing angle unknown among the living. The deep violet 3-cent regular issue of 1954 had a faint, menacing smile on the face of the Statue of Liberty. The Brussels Expedition issue of 1958 included its aerial view of the U.S. Pavilion at Brussels, and set slightly off from the other tiny fairgoers, the unmistakable silhouette of a horse and rider. There was also the Pony Express stamp Cohen had showed her in her first visit, the Lincoln 4-cent with U.S. postage, the sinister 8-cent airmail she'd seen on the tattooed sailor's letter in San Francisco. Well, it's interesting, she said, if the article's legitimate. That ought to be easy to check out, Bortz gazing straight into her eyes. Why don't you? The toothaches got worse. She dreamed of disembodied voices from whose malignance there was no appeal, the soft dusk of mirrors out of which something was about to walk, and empty rooms that waited for her. Your gynecologist has no test for what she was pregnant with. One day, Cohen called her to tell her that the final arrangements had been made to auction off Inverary's stamp collection. The Tristero forgeries were to be sold as Lot 49. And something rather disturbing, Miss Moss. A new book bidder has appeared on the scene, whom neither I nor any of the firms in the area have heard of before. That hardly ever happens. A what? Cohen explains how there were floor bidders who would attend the auction in person, and book bidders who would send in their bids by mail. These bids would be entered in a special book by the auction firm, hence the name. There would be, as was customary, no public disclosure of persons for whom the book would be bidding. And how do you know that he's a stranger? Word gets around. He's being super secretive, working through an agent, C. Morris Shrift, a very reputable good man. Morris was in touch with the auctioneers yesterday to tell them his client wanted to examine our forgeries, Lot 49, in advance. Normally, there's no objection if they know who wants to see the lot, and if he is willing to pay all the postage and insurance and get everything back inside of 24 hours. But Morris got quite mysterious about the whole thing, wouldn't tell his client's name or anything else about him, except for as far as Morris knew, he was an outsider. So, being a conservative house, naturally, they apologized and said no. What do you think? Oedipa, already knowing pretty much. That our mysterious bidder may be from Tristero, Cohen said, and saw the description of the lot in the auction catalog and wants to keep evidence that Tristero exists out of unauthorized hands. I wonder what kind of price they'll offer. Oedipa went back to Echo Course to drink bourbon until the sun went down and it was dark as it would ever get. Then, she went out and drove in the freeway for a while with her lights out to see what would happen. But angels were watching. Shortly after midnight, she found herself in a phone booth in a desolate, unfamiliar, unlit district of San Narciso. She put in a station call to the Greek Way in San Francisco, gave the musical voice that answered a description of the hackneyed, fuzz-headed, inamorado anonymous she'd talked to there and waited, inexplicable tears beginning to build pressure around her eyes. Half a minute of clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, sounds of a jukebox. Then he came on. "This is Arnold Snarb," she said, choking up. "I was in the little boy's room," he said. "The men's room was full." She told him, quickly, using up no more than a minute, that she'd learned about the Tristero, what had happened to Hilarius, Mucho, Metzger, Driblet, Fallopian. "So you are," she said. So you are," she said, "the only one I have. I don't know your name, don't want to. But I have to know whether they arranged it with you, to run into me by accident, and tell me your story about the post horn, because it may be a practical joke for you, but it stopped being one for me a few hours ago. I got drunk and went driving on these freeways. Next time I'd be more deliberate. For the love of God, human life, whatever you respect, please, help me." "Arnold," he said. There's a long stretch of bar noise. "It's over," she said. "They've saturated me. From here on, I'll only close them out. You're free, released. You could tell me." "It's too late," he said. "For me?" "For me." Before she could ask what he meant, he'd hung up. She had no more coins. By the time she could get somewhere to break the bill, he'd be gone. She stood between the public booth and the rented car in the night, her isolation complete, and tried to face toward the sea, but she'd lost her bearings. She turned, pivoting on one stacked heel, could find no mountains either, as if there would be no barriers between herself and the rest of the land. San Narciso at that moment lost, the loss pure, instant, spherical, the sound of a stainless orchestral chime held among the stars and struck lightly, gave up its residue of uniqueness for her, became a name again, and was assumed back into the American continuity of crest and mantle. Pierce Inverarity was really dead. She walked down a stretch of railroad track next to the highway. Spurs ran off here and into the factory property. Pierce may have owned these factories too, but did it matter now if he'd owned all of San Narciso? San Narciso was a name, an incident among our climactic records of dreams, and what dreams became among our accumulated daylight, a moment's squall line of tornadoes touchdown among the higher, more continental solemnities, storm systems of group suffering and need, prevailing winds of affluence. There was a true continuity. San Narciso had no boundaries. No one yet knew how to draw them. She had dedicated herself weeks ago to making sense of what Inverarity had left behind, never suspecting that the legacy was America. Might Oedipa yet be his heiress? Had that been in the will, in code, perhaps without Pierce really knowing, having been by then too seized by some headlong expansion of himself, some visit, some lucid instruction, though she would never again call back any image of the dead man to dress up, pose, talk to, and make an answer. Neither would she lose a new compassion for the cul-de-sac he tried to find a way out of, for the enigma his efforts had created. Though he had never talked business with her, she had known it to be a fraction of him that couldn't come out even, would carry forever beyond a decimal place she might name. Her love, such as it had been, remaining incommensurate with need to possess or alter the land, to bring new skylines, personal antagonisms, growth rates into being. "Keep it bouncing," he told her once. That's all the secret. Keep it bouncing." He must have known, writing the will, facing the specter, how the bouncing would stop. He might have written the testament only to harass a one-time mistress, so cynically sure of being wiped out that he could throw away all hope of being anything more. Bitterness could have run that deep in him. She just didn't know. He might himself have discovered the Tristero, and encrypted that in the will, buying into just enough to be sure she'd find it. Or he might even have tried to survive death, was a paranoia, as a true conspiracy against someone he loved. Would that breed of perversity prove at last to be too keen to be stunned even by death? Had a plot finally been devised too elaborate for the dark angel to hold at once, in his humorless vice president's head, all the possibilities of? Had something slipped through, and Inverarity by that much had beaten death? Yet she knew, head down, stumbling along the cinder bed in its old sleepers, that there was still that other chance, that it was all true, that Inverarity had only died, nothing else. Suppose, God, there was really a Tristero, and then that she had come on it by accident. If San Narciso and the estate were really no different from any other town, any other estate, then by that continuity she must have found the Tristero anywhere in her republic, though any of the 100 lightly concealed entranceways, 100 alienations, if only she looked. She stopped a minute between the steel rails, raising her head as if to sniff the air, becoming conscious of the hard, strung presence of the she stood on, knowing as if maps had been flashed for her in the sky how these tracks ran into others knowing they'd laced, deepened, authenticated the great night around her. If only she'd looked. She remembered how old Pullman cars, left where the money'd run out and the customers vanished, amid arid green farm flatness where clothes hung smoke lazed out of jointed pipes. Were the squatters there in touch with others through Tristero? They were helping carry forward that 300 years of the house's disinheritance? Surely they'd forgotten by now what it was the Tristero were to have inherited, as perhaps Oedipa one day might have. What is left to inherit? That America coded in Inverarity's testament. Whose was that? She thought of other immobilized freight cars where the kids sat on the floor planking and sang back, happy as fat, whatever came to the mother's pocket radio. Of other squatters who stretched canvas for lean-tos behind smiling billboards all along the highways or slept in junkyards at that night, up in some pole of the lineman's test like caterpillars. Swung among the web of telephone wires, living in the very copper rigging and secular miracle of communication, untroubled by the dumb voltages flickering their miles, the night long, and the thousands of unheard messages. She remembered drifters she had listened to, Americans speaking their language carefully, scholarly, as if they were in exile from somewhere else, invisible yet congruent with the cheered land she lived in. And walkers along the roads at night, zooming in and out of our headlights without looking up, too far from any town to have a real destination, and the voices before and after the dead mans that had phoned at random during the darkest, slowest hours, searching ceaseless among the dial's 10 million possibilities for that magical other who would reveal herself out of the roar of relays, monotone litanies of insult, filth, fantasy, love, whose brute repetition must someday call into being the trigger for the innameable act, the recognition, the word. How many shared Tristero's secret as well as its exile? What would the probate judge have to say about spreading some kind of a legacy among them all those nameless, maybe as a first installment? Oh boy. He'd be on her ass in a microsecond. Revoke her letter's testimony, they'd call her names. Proclaim her through the Orange County as a redistributionist and a pinko. Slip up the old man from warp wistful Kubitschek and McMingus in as administrator de Bonudon, and so much baby for code. Constellations, shadow legatees. Who knew? Perhaps she'd be hounded someday as far as joining Tristero itself, if it existed in its twilight, its aloofness, its waiting. The waiting above all, if not for another set of possibilities to replace those that had conditioned the land to accept any San Narciso among the most tender flesh without a reflex or a cry, then at least, at the very least, waiting for a symmetry of choices to break down, to go skew. She had heard all about the excluded middles. They were bad shit to be avoided. And how had it ever happened before? Here. And the chances so good for diversity. For it was now like walking among matrices of a great digital computer, the zeros and ones twinned above, hanging like balanced mobiles right and left, ahead, thick, maybe endless. Behind the hieroglyphic streets, there would either be a transcendent meaning or only the earth. In the songs Miles, Dean, Sergei, and Leonard sang was either some fraction of the truth's innumerous beauty, as Mucho now believed, or only a power spectrum. Tremaine, the swastika salesman's reprieve from Holocaust was either an injustice or the absence of a wind. The bones of the GIs at the bottom of Lake Inverarity were there either for a reason that mattered to the world or for skin divers and cigarette smokers. Ones and zeros. So did the couples arrange themselves. At Vesper Haven House, either an accommodation reached in some kind of dignity with the angel of death, or only death and the daily tedious preparations for it. Another mode of meaning behind the obvious, or none. Another Oedipa, either Oedipa in the orbiting ecstasy of true paranoia, or a real Tristero. For there either was some Tristero beyond the appearance of the legacy America, or there was just America, and if there was just America, then it seemed the only she could continue, and managed to be at all relevant to it, as an alien, unfurrowed, assumed full circle into some paranoia. Next day, with the courage you have when there's nothing more to lose, she got in touch with Seymour Shrift and inquired after his mysterious client. He decided to attend the auction in person, was all Shrift could tell her. You might run into him there, she might. The auction was duly held, on a Sunday afternoon, in perhaps the oldest building in San Narciso, dating from before World War II. Oedipa arrived a few minutes early, alone, and in a cold lobby of gleaming redwood floorboards and the smell of wax and paper, she met Genghis Cohen, who looked genuinely embarrassed. Please, don't call it a conflict of interests, he drawled earnestly, but there are some lovely Mozambique triangles I couldn't quite resist. May I ask if you've come to bid, Miss Moz? No, said Oedipa. I'm only being a busybody. We're in luck. Lauren Passerine, the finest auctioneer in the West, will be crying today. Will be what? We say an auctioneer cries a sale, Cohen said. Your fly is open, whispered Oedipa. She was not sure what she'd do if the bidder revealed himself. She had only some vague idea about causing a scene violent enough to bring the cops into it, and find out that way who the man really was. She stood in a patch of sun, among brilliant rising and the falling points of dust, trying to get a little warm, wondering if she'd go through with it. It's time to start, said Genghis Cohen, offering his arm. The men inside the auction room wore black mohair and had pale, cruel faces. They watched her come in, trying each to conceal his thoughts. Lauren Passerine, on his podium, hovered like a puppet master, his eyes bright, his smile practiced and relentless. He stared at her, smiling as if saying, I'm surprised you actually came. Oedipa sat alone, toward the back of the room, looking at the napes of necks, trying to guess which one was her target, her enemy, or perhaps her proof. An assistant closed the heavy door on the lobby windows in the sun. She heard a lock snap shut. The sound echoed a moment. Passerine held his arms in a gesture that seemed to belong to the priesthood of some remote culture, perhaps to a descending angel. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Oedipa settled back to await the crying of Lot 49. And that concludes the sixth and final chapter of Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. I hope you enjoyed.